All right, in this video, we're going to talk about drum editing if you're not in Cubase or you're not in Pro Tools. I'm looking at you Logic users. So one thing I've run into as I've been teaching people how to do this specific skill set is that some DAWs, particularly Logic, they just aren't necessarily amazing at getting the drum editing as tightly as we need it, as easily as we would hope to have it. So in looking for solutions, I can't just force everyone to use Cubase as much as I wish I could. There's plenty of other great DAWs out there for so many different reasons. I needed to find a solution where hopefully people didn't have to spend a bunch of money, or any money in this case, and they could still have a really great drum editing workflow, because drum editing, if you've watched the other videos, we can go on and on about this, but it really is so important to know how to do well. It's not to say that we need to airtight quantize every last production we do, but we need to know how to do it if we decide we need to do it, and we don't want it to take all day. We don't want it to take a week. We want to be fast and we want to be efficient, because one of the main things about recording drums and then subsequently editing drums is that this is something we want to do before we let the guitar player, the bass player, anybody do anything else, because we never want the performers, in the records that we make, performing to drums that are going to be slightly in a different place later, right? Even if we're tracking to a click, the guitar players, the vocalist, the bass player, the keyboard player, you name it, they're all going to naturally play to the feel of the drums. So if we change that feel later, all hell breaks loose. Not a good idea. So this is going to be what I found to be the best solution. I tried Luna. It was okay. There's things about it I liked, but it wasn't accurate enough. So we're going to use Reaper to edit drums, and I'm going to show you my workflow. It's maybe a little weird if you've never used Reaper before, but it's just like using any other new DAW. It's not that hard. And if you do it just a few times, I think you'll blast through it, no problem. Okay, and so just for what it's worth, this version of Reaper was just installed. There's no extra scripts. There's nothing weird. This is like a brand new install, nothing custom. So this should work for basically everybody. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to drag our drums Reaper, and we're going to position them same time position on separate tracks. That's going to give us all our drums, and that looks great to me. If we zoom out, I'm doing this with my scroll wheel, we can see all our drums here. What I want to do is I want to select all my drums. Control A should get that done, no problem. And then if we hit the G button on our keyboard, you'll see how all those turn green. That turns on group mode. If you have any problems with this, the sort of group mode overview button is here. So if this isn't green, group mode's not going to work, and you'll see it's these yellow little squares. Kind of means you're not in group mode. So if I move one thing, I move one thing. However, with this on and the outline's green, this is green. If I move one thing, I move everything. That's what we want. Some other prerequisites for this method is that we're going to want to set our BPM to the right tempo. For these drums that we've been editing for this assignment, as you know, all of the drums are at 175. So make sure your tempo is set to 175. The signature of the song is 4/4. But listen, this is going to be different. Every song you do, it's probably, honestly, every song you do will probably be 4/4. There'll be some 3/4, maybe some 5/4, but largely Western music is in 4/4. And then, the BPM is going to be different. So, but these things are absolutely critical to have right before we get going here. So naturally, when we're in group mode, we have our items grouped here, and we click one track, they all select. We actually need to augment that, and I'm going to show you how. So you remember that sort of overlording group mode icon over here? I want you to right click that, and I want you to turn off selecting one item selects group. We're going to deselect that now. So the cool thing about this is that we can select a singular item, as we've done here. However, we can still move everything together despite the fact that only one item is selected at any given moment. This is going to come into play in a minute, and I'll show you exactly why. Now, the next thing we want to do, though, before I explain that, is we're going to want to put our very first hit of the drums on the downbeat. If you're curious what a downbeat is, it's any of these ones that start with 0.1. So it really doesn't matter which one you pick. I seem to be kind of close to, let's see here, 67.1. So I'm gonna just put the snare right on that line. And some other good ideas, because we're going to be primarily quantizing our shells. So that is kick. I'll make that track a little bigger. We can just drag the bottom of these tracks to do that. Snare, we're going to do our rack tom, or high tom in this case. And we're also going to do our floor tom. This just makes things a little bit easier visually, so we know that the tracks that look bigger are the ones that we're going to be primarily working with. The next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to set an individual threshold, and I'll show you that in a second, for all of the different items that we want to quantize to. And sort of in my trying to find a good solution for Logic users and people who don't have an elegant solution for drum editing natively in their DAW, I said earlier in the video I tried Luna, and there's some other ones too, but what I didn't love is that they didn't let us do what this next step is going to be. And this next step is really, really important for us to be able to drum edit quickly and accurately. And that is essentially, we've got our transient here. We're going to set a threshold level, right? And we're going to want to bring it down just to the right point where we are getting the snare or the kick or the tom or whatever it is we want, but not so much that we're getting all the bleeds. So let me show you how to do that. So we're going to start with snare, and I've got snare selected here. And if you ever want to select a whole track, even if there's edits or not, you can just double click the track over here and it will do that. So I'm going to do that here. And if I do that, regardless of the edits or whatever, I know that I've selected the entire snare track. That's an important thing. Now we're going to hit D on the keyboard. D is going to bring up our dynamic split items. Effectively speaking, you're just going to want to copy what you see here. So if this is selected, unselect it. If this is selected, unselect it. We just want at transients. There's another thing that's probably going to be selected incorrectly, and it's going to be split selected items. We do not want this. This is probably what is there by default. We want split selected and grouped items, and you can kind of see how putting these into a group comes into play here. Now, here's this really important part that I was just talking to you about, which is individually setting the threshold and the sensitivity. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to zoom out a little bit here. And I want us to look at this snare track. Do you see these dotted lines? That is where, if I left these settings right here, where Reaper would split. Well, clearly that's not the case. Our threshold is way too low, and we've got a kick drum in here, right? That's no good. And what if our sensitivity was really high? Well, it'd be splitting all over the place. So it's really a balance of these two settings that's going to give us what we're looking for. So why don't we just start with sensitivity somewhere around 50, right? And let's bring our threshold up. And the cool thing is, as we bring this up, we can literally see it increase. So I'm going to keep doing that, right? Up, 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 up. And you can see right here, our threshold lines are crossing our transients. I'm going to bring it down a little bit. Great. If you aren't seeing these lines, that probably means you don't have display threshold in media items while this window is open selected. So if yours looks like this, well, you're not going to see the threshold lines, and it's not going to be as easy to get the desired results. So we're going to turn that back on. That looks good. But we have other problems. Do you notice how this song starts with flams? A flam in drummer language is effectively when you're using two hands very close to one another. They aren't 16th notes, they aren't 32nd notes. It's just a natural rough. They sound awesome, especially when performed well. Very rock and roll, very exciting, but we certainly don't want our flams to be, each hit of our flams, I should say, to be quantized independently. We just want the first part of the flam to land right on the grid. So what are we going to do? We're going to push our sensitivity down. All right, so you notice I pushed my sensitivity down a little bit. We got rid of some, but not all. So we're going to go a little further. I'm primarily looking at this one right here. Let me move my cursor out of the way. And we really want that to go away. So sensitivity down. Beautiful. So now I'm scrolling through and I'm wondering, was that enough? Looks like it wasn't. We're going to go down with sensitivity a little bit more. That looks good to me. And as I'm scrolling through, this flam is also only catching the first part of the flam. That's great. And this is going to be some of the, slightly trickier, more challenging things you do. By and large, most snare hits in any given song is a single hit, right? But we do run into flams from time to time. And I think it's a really good idea for us to just sort of scroll through and make sure this looks right. And you can see Reaper's done a really good job at just selecting right at the front of the transients. In that selection, its accuracy in that selection, of which we are helping it with this panel, is really the main difference maker when it comes to making sure that our drum edits come out, nice and tight and quickly. Now, mind you, this is going to go way faster for you after you get a lot of reps in. I'm just kind of slowly explaining this as we go and sort of showing you, hey, you don't want to skip over this part, and just assume it's right. You want to do what I'm doing, right? Which is effectively scrolling through and just saying, yeah, this all looks good, right? I've got my dotted line here, which just indicates where it's going to cut. So, and we just go through, you do the whole thing. So once we've gone through all the snares and we've more or less decided, okay, all of these look good. All of these dotted lines that we have here and all of these different hits, they look exactly where they're supposed to be. I don't have extras. I'm not missing any. And we've set up our dynamic split window the way that we're supposed to, which is to say at transients, here where we have split selected and grouped items, we get to split. Now you'll notice beautifully, we have split all of the tracks because they are grouped, but we've split them from the threshold markers we made from just the snare. So now we're going to move on. We're going to do the same thing for kick. And if you remember, the way I told you to select the kick or the snare or whatever, just to be extra safe, is to double click up here. Don't click here, double click here. This is going to bring up all of our kicks as individual selections, and we'll for sure not miss any. Once again, we're going to hit D, and we're going to follow a very similar process. Now, a lot of times the kick might be a little bit simpler. It is in general a little bit simpler of a waveform and simpler of an input signal. You know, the hands can get really busy. You know, the kick beater to the kick head, it's not that it can't have its own nuance, but it is by and large a simpler waveform, and hopefully will have you know, less to do when it comes to setting your threshold and setting your sensitivity. As far as I can tell, the settings that we were left off with from the snare, they look great here. So once again, let's say we went all the way through this stuff and we were like, this looks good, just in the same way we did for the snare. Our settings down here in the dynamic window are the same. We split once again, and voila. Now we've got splits on our snares, and we've got splits on our kicks. And I bet you know what we're going to do next. We're going to move on to the high tom. Again, we're not going to click here. We're going to double click the track itself. This highlights everything. Now we're going to want to go and we're going to find some rack toms. So let's get in here. Of course, I've unselected things, as is easy to do. We're going to reselect. And what do we see? So we see, oh, first of all, let's hit D once again. And we don't see the lines looking exactly how we want them. As you can see here, we've got the dotted line. Here we've got the dotted line. Here we've got the dotted line. Here, not so much. So we're going to adjust, in this case, our sensitivity. As we move our sensitivity up, next thing you know, there you go. We have that dotted line. And so you're going to want to repeat this process. If you want to zoom in, go ahead and zoom in and check all this stuff out. Make sure you highlight, dotted line, dotted line, dotted line, dotted line. And it's doing a really good job. So this is great. So now we can split yet again. One bit of caution before we split from our racks again though, is I want you to notice, what do we see here? We see the bleed here from this snare drum has a dotted line. We're not going to want to make a split there. So we have two options, right? We know that we need our sensitivity higher because we needed to capture this drum. However, we might have some room in our threshold. So why don't we raise that? Beautiful. We brought our threshold above the bleed. We still have enough for our rack tom, and now we should be able to cut. Perfect. So we've got one more thing to do here, and that is going to be floor tom. In this particular set of stems and song, the only place you're going to find floor tom is going to be right here at the end of the song. There's two floor tom hits, and we can use these and just operate the same way we've been operating, highlight everything. And as you can see, neither of these seem to be getting picked up. Now, the threshold looks okay. It's meeting it. Maybe we'll bring it down a little bit and see if we get something. We don't. So what I'm thinking is we need more sensitivity here. And just like that, we have the dotted lines. Again, this is our last one. And in our dynamic split window here, we're going to do our final split of our shells. Now, this is going to be, you know, if you have more toms, you do the exact same thing. If you had one less tom, you do it one less time. But by and large, you know, it's going to be kick, snare, and usually at least two toms, but it's just however many shells you so happen to have. So let's split. So now to recap, we have our kicks, our snares, our racks, and our floor toms all separated out into individual regions. And we did that by custom tailoring our threshold and our sensitivity and hitting slice. So now what we need to do is actually quantize these drums. To do that, it's not too hard. We're going to go to item, and then we are going to go down to item processing. And inside of item processing, we're going to go to the quantize item positions to grid. Now, if we click this, it's not just going to auto quantize. We're going to get a menu that pops up. And by the way, a good idea if you plan on doing this a lot, you can go and you can set this to a hotkey, similar to how we have dynamic split set to D. You could set this to Q or whatever you want, but if you don't want to do that, it's up here, like I said, in item processing, and then quantize item positions to grid. So the vast majority of the time, these are the settings that you're going to want to be using, at least in my opinion. I typically quantize to 16th notes. I have move grouped items with selected items selected. So that means I can have any one of these tracks selected. It doesn't matter. It's in the group, so it's going to move. And then these are our crossfade settings. And by default, Reaper sets these to 30 milliseconds. You don't want that. For this type of work, what you're looking for is something closer to 3 milliseconds. And once all of this is set up, just like how you see it here, we're going to click process. Just like that, Reaper will have quantized all your drums. Now, this is not to say that everything is necessarily absolutely perfect, but it should do the lion's share of the work. And what I like to do is I like to just sort of scroll along here. Now, for me, I'm doing this by holding Alt and using the mouse wheel. For you, it might be a little bit different. And we're going to look for things that are maybe not exactly perfect. These all look great on the grid, but you see this right here? As I zoom in on this, what we can see is this crossfade actually contains some of the audio from this. So we want to move this crossfade over, and we can literally just pull the ends until we don't have any artifacts in there anymore. And it's typically a pretty good idea to just zoom in pretty deeply. It doesn't have to be crazy, but just so that we can kind of see what's going on and just kind of look at our crossfades and look for things of this nature. When we see something like this, click in, zoom in, and just get rid of this little glitch here. Those little glitches, just so you know, will cause havoc in your recordings. So we want to make sure that we don't have any of those. And there's a little bit of muscle memory that has to happen here, but over time, you'll get used to it. And even myself, I'm not a pro. I typically do this stuff in Cubase, but I wanted to learn this and show you guys how to do it for yourself, just for the people who, like I said, are in Logic or, you know, or a DAW where they don't have great drum editing capabilities, and then so therefore they need a better solution. If we're noticing that this seems to be happening over and over, let's do this to all of our crossfades, right? I think we just did that all at once, and now let's keep cruising through. And as you can see, I didn't pull them quite far enough. I still had an artifact there, but do you see how when I have Control A, I have everything selected? I can do all of these at once. So if we find that in general, hey, these crossfades are a little bit too close to the transient, we can pull them all to the left by Control A and then just dragging them like I showed you here. So this is looking much better. And then this way you don't have to correct each and every last snare hit, you know, with the with the crossfade. You can just kind of do it all at once. All right, fantastic. So what we just did, I sort of refer to as phase 1 of drum editing. If you're working with me in this capacity, you'll know that I think there are 4 phases of drum editing. Phase 1 is shells. That's what we've just done, and we've automated most of it, if not all of it. Now, mind you, do we still need to play this back and go through and make sure that we didn't make any mistakes? Or I shouldn't say that Reaper in this case didn't make any mistakes. Yes, and if something's not where it's supposed to go, does it need to go where it's supposed to go? Of course it does. But this will do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. In phase 2 of the editing, I go for any of the cymbal hits that are percussive in nature. So that's going to be tight hi-hats. That could be bell rides. Anything that is very obviously percussive and kind of short and jumps out of the mix and isn't overly washy. So a good example of what you wouldn't edit this way would be in the chorus of this song, where we have this big like crashy, just like shh thing going on. There's no reason to try to get in there and grab every, you know, cymbal hit, but absolutely for all that type stuff, you're going to want to get in there. This part, I'll be honest, is much harder to automate. And when you have parts like this in your songs, truthfully, it's going to take a little longer to edit. But I promise you that the juice is worth the squeeze on this one. Your productions will be better for it, and it's something that you should develop the muscle memory for. So why don't we dive into that now? So now, given that this song has, well, a ton of hi-hat work, we're going to make the hi-hat track bigger. That's the one we're going to want to look at for what we're about to do. And I'm going to show you, it's a manual workflow, but it's pretty quick. So let's make our hi-hat track really big. This way it becomes really obvious where our hi-hat is. So we can see here, the hi-hat is mostly on time, maybe just a little bit ahead, but this next hi-hat is definitely way ahead. So we're going to want to fix that. We'll start here. All we really have to do is we have to split this so that we can move this piece independently. Now to split in Reaper, we hit S. But the problem you're going to see right away is it created this fade out and this fade in that we're actually not really looking for. We're actually looking for crossfades, just like we had for the rest of our edits. So I'm going to Control Z out of that. Now we want to go to Preferences, and we're going to change one thing. You can go to Options and then Preferences, but I always hit Control P on PC, and I think it's Option P on Mac. Either way, it's going to bring up this window full of different options, but the one that we're looking for is under Project, Item Fade Defaults. Now remember when I said when we were doing our quantizing, we wanted 3 milliseconds? We're going to set that up here as well, but we're not done yet. When we have our split media item, where it says no crossfade here, we're going to do an overlapping crossfade and hit OK. Now when I hit S, we get a beautiful crossfade right here, and our hi-hat is separated out. This becomes really easy. We select the hi-hat that we want, and we can move it manually. On PC, this is Alt. On Mac, it's going to be Option probably. You'll have to experiment, but it'll be one of the modifier buttons. And I can just scroll along here. I do that by holding Alt and using my mouse wheel. I'm going to select right before the hi-hat again. I'm going to tap S. I'm going to hold Alt, and I'm going to put it right where it goes. The beautiful thing also we're seeing is that when we do this process, again, we're going to hit S, and we're going to hit Alt, and we're going to move everything. It's moving all of the tracks at once. That's so important, right? If we do this, we see how everything is moving. That's because our group mode is still engaged. And now all we have to do is just kind of cruise through. Look for any hi-hat, just like this one that's ahead. Hit S, hold Alt, drag it to where it goes. Click here, hit S, hold Alt, drag it to where it goes. Click here, hit S, hold Alt, drag it right where it goes. All right, so that's phase 2. It's a manual process. I wish it automated better. It just kind of doesn't. You're not going to have to do it for every song you record. Some songs don't have closed hi-hats. Some songs don't have tight bell rides, but it's worth doing. And that's, in my opinion, the fastest way that I know how to do it inside of Reaper. We've only got 2 phases left, and they're actually quite a bit easier than the first 2. Phase 3 is going to be fixing what I call bad flams. We can call this unintentional flams, bad flams, whatever you want. So we talked earlier in the video about flams in general, right? We have these snares. This is the 2 successive hits that are meant to make the snare kind of sound bigger, very rock and roll. It's kind of like a natural rough, and they're intended to be 2 different hits. Bad flams are when we have 2 items of a drum set, usually a kick and a snare, or maybe a kick and a floor tom, a snare and a floor tom, that are supposed to be exactly on the same beat, yet they are not. I just so happen to know where we can find some bad flams in this song, and you're typically going to find them in places like this. This is like during a build-up. So if I once again make my kick track pretty big, and I make my snare track pretty big, and I'm looking out for this stuff, let's have a look here. All right, what do we see? So we see we've got a kick on top of a snare. This is a build-up, and we can see right here, and I'm going to zoom in on this, that our kick is behind our snare. Well, this is the only time I'm ever going to tell you to do this. We want to move the kick track, or as many kick tracks as we have in this case, over on top of the snare. Now, this will break some phase rules. Again, this is the only time I'll ever advocate for this, but I do think it's worth doing. This is the one time where I kind of think, okay, moving the kick out of phase, but just to make it really tight with the snare is probably the right move. The problem is, if we were to try to highlight these in Alt drag, we still have group mode on. Everything's going to move. Easy solution. We're going to turn group mode off, keep these 2 highlighted, and just like that, we're fixed. Let's move on to the next one. This one looks pretty good, although that snare should have been fixed. That would have happened during our phase 1. But let's keep moving, and let's find another one that could use a little bit of help. Here's a perfect example. So we can see our snare is on the grid, yet our kick is behind. So once again, I'm going to click and control click below to highlight both. Now I'm holding Alt, and you'll know that you have the right icon here because you see that right and left arrow attached to my icon. That means you're going to be able to slide these inside of what I call the region boundaries here, which is really, really helpful. And then we just slide this right over to the grid line. Okay, so we've made it through phase 1, 2, and 3 now. So we've got all of these edits, and the problem here is that we've got crossfades all over the place. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to glue that stuff. So we're going to hit Control A. Once you have everything selected, you can see we still have our crossfades. We're going to right click. You can right click anywhere you want. And we're just going to come down here to glue items. Click that. Boom. No more crossfades. All right, this brings us to phase number 4. So what's phase number 4? Phase number 4 is sort of 2 things at once. Ultimately, phase number 4 is replacing hits that could be better. So one thing about this is a cut and drag method of editing. So one thing about a cut and drag method with editing is that you may end up with some undesired artifacts, right? A perfect example is you have a kick drum that's too close to the snare drum. You have to pull the kick drum away. And then when you crossfade in back towards the snare drum, it has to create some duplicate data in order to fill that gap. As you'll see as you quantize, sometimes you're making overlaps, sometimes you're making gaps. So gaps are more dangerous than overlaps. And so when you're making a gap and you have to fill in the space, a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, sometimes and enough of the time, it'll just create an odd sounding artifact and something that we certainly wouldn't want on our record. So the way we get around that is we literally just move through and listen to our tracks and we replace things. So if there's a hit that is sounding weird, find another hit that's really similar. So for example, this song has a ton of like tight hi-hat, right? So a lot of like hi-hat over snare, and maybe we have a bad edit there. And if that's the case, just look around for a different one, hopefully one that's nearby, because usually the dynamics are similar enough. You just pull it out and then you put it right back where the other one was. All right, and that's basically it. So for the Reaper uninitiated, and honestly, I'm not too distant from that. I don't use Reaper a lot. I'm 20 years deep into Cubase. Some of you are 10, 20 years deep into, whatever DAW is of your choice. And like, for example, if it's Logic, it just might not be that good at this one particular task, but it's great for everything else. So instead of jumping ship and thinking that you've got to buy a new DAW or whatever it is, you can use this workflow in a DAW that's effectively free and just make it part of your deal. So the drummer comes in, you get great takes, you comp those takes, and before you let the bass player play, before you let the guitar player play, or whatever it is, you want to make sure that your editing is exactly what it's going to be on the final record. And again, that's because your other musicians are going to play to the drums that they hear. You don't want to break that relationship. You don't want to have the drums moving later. And subsequently, that's why it's so important to do great editing and to do it early on in the project.